last Friday, just to catch you guys up, Trump met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska. On Monday, Trump met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office. Then he had a second meeting with Zelensky that included like half of Europe. It was leaders from the EU, Finland, France, Germany, Italy, NATO, and the UK. Trump says the next step in this kind of like ad hoc Ukraine peace process could be a bilateral meeting between Putin and Zelensky. Consider me skeptical that that will ever happen, or that Putin himself would take the meeting and not send some like, third tier flunky to meet with Zelensky, but we'll see. And then if that goes well, I think the plan is to have a trilateral meeting that includes Trump, Putin, and Zelensky, which according to Politico would be held in Budapest. So it's good to get Viktor Orban involved.
Not exactly a home game for Zelensky.
Glad we could get another autocrat in on the game.
Why don't you just have the meeting at CPAC?
So we're going to break this into chunks. Again, like I said, we're going to do the substance, then we'll do the long-term issues, and then we'll do the optics. But also, can you just imagine like putting together a Obama-Putin summit in a week? That's basically what they did with the Alaska one.
Well, they didn't exactly anticipate some of the traps, though. Like that's what happens when you throw it together in a week. You get rolled by the Russians.
Yeah, you didn't quite nail it. Okay, so substantively, the Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska, it was not the worst-case scenario for Ukraine, right? Like a lot of Ukrainians and Europeans were scared that Trump and Putin would basically announce a deal and say, take it or leave it, Zelensky. That didn't happen, but what came out of it was still quite bad. Trump just completely abandoned his demand that Putin agree to a ceasefire, and he's now pretending that ceasefires aren't even important.
Yeah.
He's like, well, who even cares about that?
After pushing for one for 7 months.
Yeah, demanding one for months. In the meeting, Putin demanded that Ukraine hand over not only territory in eastern Ukraine that they are occupying currently, but also territory that Russia hasn't been able to capture. Specifically, Putin wants Zelensky to hand over all of Donetsk and Luhansk, but Russian troops only control 3/4 of Donetsk province, and the portion Putin doesn't control but wants includes this 30-mile stretch called the Fortress Belt that is heavily fortified with razor wire, bunkers, trenches, minefields, tank traps. Basically, like every military expert says, if you hand over that part of Donetsk, it will make it exponentially easier for Putin to invade again and then go deeper into Ukraine. So that was all very bad. We'll get into the more maximalist demands in a minute, the root causes of the war, the so-called root causes of the war. The one bright spot out of Alaska, Ben, were reports that both Trump and Putin are open to some sort of security guarantee for Ukraine as part of a deal. And that kind of brings us to Monday. Trump again said he's open to a security guarantee, that the U.S. would contribute to it. But on Tuesday morning on Fox and Friends, Trump ruled out sending U.S. troops to Ukraine or the security guarantee being through NATO. Here's a clip from Fox and Friends.
I hope President Putin is going to be good. And if he's not, it's going to be a rough situation. And I hope that President Zelensky will do what he has to do. He has to show some flexibility also. I assume you've all seen the map. A big chunk of territory is taken. And that territory has been taken. Now, they're talking about Donbass, but Donbass right now, as you know, is 79% owned and controlled by Russia. There'll be some form of security. It can't be NATO because that's just not something that would ever happen. They couldn't do that.
Donbass, the dumbass. Zelensky said he hopes the details of the security guarantee will be formalized in the next 10 days. Zelensky also mentioned something about a $90 billion arms deal between the U.S. and Ukraine. So Ben, our producer Saul described this whole thing as a reverse iceberg. Lots of superficial things happening at the surface. When you look under the waterline, no real substance holding it up. I'd love your big picture thoughts on kind of what was actually came out of the discussions. And then more specifically, let's just dig into what you think a meaningful security guarantee would actually have to look like. Because I personally am quite skeptical that a few thousand European troops sitting in Ukraine is much of a deterrent unless they're authorized to shoot back at the Russians and if they're backed by the full force of the U.S. military, which I'm skeptical Trump is willing to do.
Yeah, there are two real substantive issues that are completely unresolved. And while it wasn't the worst case scenario in terms of Trump coming out and announcing that there's an agreement and kind of forcing on Zelensky, he kind of behind closed doors seemed to have accepted that premise from Putin and then behind closed doors presented to Zelensky. And the real issues are territory and security guarantees, and they're related, right? So the first point is, in addition to Crimea, which I think everybody would acknowledge,
right,
it's impossible to foresee any scenario where Ukraine's getting that back. There are 4 other territories of Ukraine that Russia has formally annexed. And 2 of them would be in the category that you laid out, Luhansk and Donetsk, that's the Donbass that Trump talks about. So taken together, that's the Donbass, which is, a resource-rich part of Ukraine, an industrial part of Ukraine. What Putin wants is essentially all of that territory, which does two things. One, it kind of confirms his annexation as legitimate. So instead of even just accepting maybe as part of some frozen conflict, well, the Russians are there, they're not going to leave, but we don't we reject the legitimacy of this. It's kind of saying, sure, Putin's whole idea of invading this country and then having some Potemkin referenda at the barrel of a gun and annexing it is not only legitimate, it's so legitimate that we're going to force the Ukrainians to abandon their remaining land so he can have it. So it fully legitimizes his invasion as a successful tool of territorial expansion. But then importantly to the security guarantees, it leaves Ukraine with even less defensible borders, right?
Yep.
So you not only lose all that fortified front line that the Ukrainians have built, right? That barbed wire,
fortress
trenches,
belt, yeah.
all the fortressing, but you're just kind of leaving them with even less defensible borders. Like imagine if you ceded the entire, eastern coastline of the United States to an adversary that was bigger than you, and they could just build up their military force there to try to reinvade you at a second point.
Yeah,
right?
imagine if the Russians invaded Massachusetts from the east and they got to Worcester, and then we cut a deal and we were like, you know what? Take the rest.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's crazy.
You're not only legitimizing what they are already occupying, you're saying, we'll give you some more so you can stop invading, right?
I'm really meeting with people where they're at by giving the Worcester reference point, because everyone knows where Worcester, Mass is. Anyway, continue.
Boy.
Google it. I
Now,
don't care.
the security guarantee
I'm a
thing,
masshole.
what the Ukrainians want is if they are going to lose this territory, if they have to basically accept some reality in which Russia is going to consume part of their land, they want to make sure that Russia cannot reinvade and that the remaining Ukraine, the 70 to 80% of Ukraine that they continue to keep as a sovereign state, will be protected against not just invasion, but will be kind of integrated into, because they can't rebuild, they can't reconstruct, they can't have the millions of Ukrainians who've left come back with confidence if everybody's worried that the Russians are going to try to dominate or try to take over the country again. Now, the Ukrainian preference for this would be NATO membership, because then you have an Article 5 commitment to collective defense. Article 5 commitment means if Russia invades, NATO is going to come to Ukraine's defense. Short of that, they want some troops on the ground, right? But this is where it's kind of a backdoor NATO thing, because if you've got the UK, Germany, France, and some of these other countries who said they put troops in, well, those are NATO countries, right?
Yep.
And so if you have that force there, there's some ambiguity that, well, if Russia invades and that force is willing to engage the Russian forces, well, then suddenly there's an argument that an Article 5 commitment might be triggered, even if maybe it's not Ukraine, but it's because they're NATO countries that are now in a war. And to be very clear, this isn't because anybody wants that to happen. It's because we don't want it to happen.
Exactly.
Like you want
a deterrent.
Yeah, it's a deterrent, right? Now, what Trump seems to want is a toothless security guarantee. What you saw some things out of the summit yesterday that will sell Ukraine $90 billion of weapons, like as if giving them weapons is a security guarantee. We've heard in the past that the critical minerals agreement is kind of a security guarantee because Russia won't invade if we're like extracting minerals from Ukraine. Or
Yeah,
maybe.
By the way, all those minerals are in eastern Ukraine.
Most of which Russia.
Which we're now coughing over to.
We're coughing
Russia.
up, exactly.
Anyway. Crazy to me that we spend so much time yelling about this stupid minerals deal when like all the minerals are now going to go to the Russians.
Go to the Russians anyway. Which Putin
trying to make
is.
sense of this is probably a mistake.
So the question, I think Trump might be open to these Europeans being there, but he kind of wants it to be as feckless as possible. Hey, the U.S. has nothing to do with it. Wink, wink, we won't come to the defense of these people. We won't be part of the kind of supply lines to these people. We have nothing to do with it at all. And so essentially it's kind of a toothless security guarantee. That touches the deepest chords of fears for the Ukrainians because in 1994, the Budapest Memorandum, which we've talked about on this podcast, there was a security guarantee for Ukraine that was toothless. It was agreed between the United States and Russia and and the UK that essentially Ukraine's territorial integrity would be guaranteed if they gave up their nuclear weapons. And guess what? They gave up their nuclear weapons and they got invaded.
Yep.
And so they don't trust, for good reason, security guarantees that are written down on paper without anything tangible. After the meeting yesterday, the Russians already went out and said they won't accept any foreign forces on Ukrainian soil, so they won't accept any security guarantees whatsoever. So, to wind back the tape, despite these two summits, despite all the pageantry, nothing is different today than before in the sense that Putin still wants all the land he's annexed, and he wants no credible security guarantee, and he appears to have Trump pretty much on board with that, although Trump's left this door open a crack on security guarantees, and the Ukrainians and the Europeans are just scrambling to kind of keep that from being the maximalist position.
Now, I think you're being unfair because I think some progress was made because Putin got Trump to walk away from his demand for a ceasefire. And apparently we're just giving up on putting secondary sanctions on other countries if they buy Russian oil. Remember when he was threatening Modi and the Indian government a few weeks ago and saying you got to stop buying Russian oil? Apparently that's gone.
Yeah.
So, okay.
So Putin made a lot of progress.
The big concession that Putin gave Trump was flattery and then a political gift by saying, "Oh yeah, I would never have invaded if you were president. It was Joe Biden's fault." Basically, that was like all that happened.
Which is really smart of Putin because he realizes
cost free.
And this is what is so important, and we should talk more about this. What leaders have realized is Trump doesn't actually care about the substance of the quote unquote deal. He just cares how it looks.
Headlines.
Are people kissing his ass?
Yeah.
Can he spin his narrative? So Putin comes, and what does he bring? He doesn't bring a concession on territory or security guarantees or ceasefires or anything, really. Not even partial ceasefires. I'm sure he's got that in his back pocket.
Right? Flattery.
He brings mail-in balloting is bullshit and costs you the 2020 election. I didn't interfere in the 2016 election.
Right.
Russia hoax, which we heard from Trump at the press conference. You are such a great peacemaker. None of this is substantive. None of this matters whatsoever.
Let's do the optics, and one's like, well, let's do the root causes into the optics, because you're right, because they fold together. But what he did bring that you mentioned earlier is this demand to deal with the root causes of the war. And so, but when Putin, it's important to understand what Putin means by that, because it's a long list. It can mean some or all of basically the following, which is freezing the battle lines and forcing Ukraine to give up tons of territory, like you talked about Crimea, but also the eastern Ukraine, the Donbass region. NATO membership has to be off the table for Ukraine. Putin has also talked about rolling back NATO expansion to where it was in the late 90s. So I'm not sure if the wish list is going to include Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic suddenly being out of NATO. It's not an insane thing to imagine. He wants to limit the size of the Ukrainian military. I'm sure he wants Zelensky gone. I mean, early on in the war, right, Putin always talked about the need for the denazification of Ukraine, which is a remarkable thing to say about a Jewish head of state. But we haven't heard that phrasing in a while, but I'd imagine that Zelensky will be gone. But I think when you understand what root causes means, it just speaks to how difficult it will be to get to a comprehensive peace deal, because it really isn't just about the Ukrainians and the Russians doing something hard. He's trying to factor in, he's trying to dictate NATO's actions and dictate the actions of Europe.
That's right. And so to kind of break down a couple pieces of this are really important is that Putin, there's a Ukraine and then there's NATO. Now in Ukraine, in root causes, Putin doesn't think the Ukraine should exist as a state.
Yes.
He would have liked to have essentially, if not conquered Ukraine, conquered a piece of it, annexed it, and then had a pro-Russian leader back in charge in Kyiv, and he can kind of dominate them and not have to worry about them aligning with the West. He might still get that, right? Because he's trying to pocket the annexation with Trump. But he wants them to not only not have security guarantees, he wants them to not really have a military. And his argument to Trump is, how could I deal with a military that could threaten me? The Ukrainian military is not going to invade Russia, right? So the question is just, can they have a credible enough military so that they're not reinvaded again? We can come back to that. On the NATO piece, I think what he wants is, look, if you look at the clock, that's when the three Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, joined NATO. So it's not just, yes, it's Poland and it's that entire, every country that essentially borders Ukraine or Russia, essentially is, Finland, which has recently joined. I think he understands, Putin does, maybe, that it's unlikely they're going to be kicked out of NATO. But I think what he wants is no NATO presence in those countries. So Ukraine is demilitarized, and NATO has no military presence. There's no boots on the ground. There's no infrastructure in these kind of eastern flank countries. Mm-hmm. You can see why that's a scary prospect, because if there's no NATO presence in the Baltics, what's to stop Putin from taking a chunk of the Baltics? Right. And by the way, if you think that I'm now being hyperbolic, well, he's got a chunk of Georgia. He's got a chunk of Moldova. He's got a chunk of Ukraine. Every former Soviet state that's not a Central Asian republic, he essentially is taking a chunk of. Belarus is kind of a satellite.
Right, and the reason why is because Putin called the dissolution of the Soviet Union, quote, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. This is an imperialist, nationalist project. This is not just spheres of influence. This is about reconstituting the Russian Empire for him.
That's right. And he's doing it like piece by piece, he's like bite by bite, right? And that is a scary, scary prospect to reward that kind of behavior in any way, shape, or form. Now, the one other thing I'd add, Tommy, because we've talked about so many of these pieces over the years on this podcast, is that Putin also knows that the J.D. Vances of the world and the kind of Silicon Valley, all-in pods of the world have been intellectual Zambonis for Putin's arguments. Mm-hmm. Oh, NATO expansion is what led him to invade Ukraine. We overreach. Zelensky's obstinate. By Trump taking Putin's side, essentially, and it's somehow Ukraine's fault that they were invaded. It's somehow every previous president's fault that this happened. NATO expansion never should have happened. Whatever you think about those things, having the president of the United States essentially, because he wants to own the libs at home, essentially launder Putin's arguments into American foreign policy, it makes it so that Putin is just pushing against an open door. I should say, if you're listening to this and saying, well, Ben, how the fuck should this war end? There's a way in which the war ends, in which, yes, Russia is going to be in a bunch of the territory they're in, but that everything on the other side of that is protected. That essentially there is a credible security guarantee for Ukraine.
Right.
They're in the European Union. If they're not in NATO, there's such a sufficient NATO commitment to Ukraine that Russia couldn't invade again. And Ukraine can become a viable, successful state where their people can move back, even if they're going to lose some land. What Trump is doing is not only potentially sacrificing the land, but he's putting that in doubt, right?
Right. He's making them sitting ducks. And you can hear that. That is clearly Zelensky's core concern. It's the security guarantee going forward so this doesn't happen again, because Trump is like, oh, well, I think he wants to cut a deal for me. And I think he'll sign a piece of paper.
For me? Why would,
like an enshrine in legislation that he'll never invade again. And if you believe that, you, sir, are a fucking idiot. And that's kind of the point.
What's so crazy about this is that Vladimir Putin is a man who has invaded Ukraine multiple times over the objections of the rest of the world, invaded Syria and supported war crimes there over the objections of the rest of the world. He could give two fucks about what Donald Trump thinks about anything. What he's getting out of this, because people keep asking me, like, well, what is Putin getting? Is he running Trump as an asset, blah, blah, blah. What he's getting is that the United States looks like an incompetent, completely clueless superpower.
He's owning the West.
He's owning the West. The West is divided against itself. It looks weak. It looks pathetic.
Our systems look weak.
Our system is being dismantled. We look like we're taking his arguments because Trump needs to use his arguments. And sure, he can give Trump the win of looking like the quote-unquote peacemaker who's convening meetings, but he gets everything he wants.
Yep.
That's what's happening.
Yes. So we wanted to lead with the substance, because we're substance guys. But I think the optics...
Substance bros.
Substance bros. But the optics and visuals of these various meetings, I do think kind of tell you everything you need to know. Like the folks watching on YouTube will actually see some images and still photos of what we're talking about here. And by the way, thank you to everyone who subscribed to Pod Save the World on YouTube. Lots of people did the last time we asked. And if you haven't, please consider doing so now. Because, right-wing media, they got a lot of YouTube subscribers. They're killing us on YouTube.
Probably some bots in there, too.
Yeah, a lot of bots. Yeah. But what that means in practice is when people search for political news on YouTube, they find crap like TPUSA or like Marjorie Taylor Greene's boyfriend, wherever he works. And we're trying to get them good information in the YouTube algorithm. So thank you for subscribing. So let's just go through these events chronologically, right? So in Alaska, Trump literally rolls out the red carpet for Putin. He gives Putin a ride in the presidential limo, something I've never seen before. There was all this chummy banter and bullshitting around. There was a military flyover of a B-2 bomber, which all these MAGA morons thought was some big flex. But showing off military hardware, first of all, is autocrat 101. Two, did you think that Putin thought we might bomb him?
We might kill him or something?
He's standing next to Trump.
Yeah.
What did people... I don't know. Anyway. Then, so Trump and Putin were supposed to meet one-on-one. That turns into a 3-on-3 meeting. So it's Trump, Steve Witkoff, and Marco Rubio, and then Putin, Sergei Lavrov, and Yuri Ushakov. So it's Trump, his golf buddy, and weak little Marco, who's probably sipping waters the whole time, against the former KGB guy and the two most experienced and savvy foreign policy minds in the Russian government, right? So they're completely outgunned at that meeting. And then Trump lets Putin talk first at the press conference. He gets lectured. He barely speaks. He doesn't take questions from the press. So Putin gets the images he wanted, where he's being welcomed back into the international community before the meetings happen. Then the meetings happen. He doesn't give an inch on policy. In fact, he gets concessions from Trump. Then they skip this lunch they're supposed to have. They don't take questions from the press, and then they leave. So it's a full-on domination by Putin and the Russians. Then on Monday, Zelensky meets with Trump and the various delegations in the Oval Office, the Ukrainian U.S. delegations. That goes way better than the last meeting. Trump's team told Politico, quote, "The vibe between the president and Zelensky was terrific." So good to see that was better, but low bar. And then Trump has a couple meetings with Zelensky and the European leaders. And one of the meetings was in the Oval Office. And the image should be on the screen now, Ben, where like you have Trump behind the Resolute desk and then all the Europeans sitting in front of him in like shitty little chairs. And they literally look like school children in a classroom crowded around the teacher, who, by the way, had a map of Ukraine up, as if Zelensky needed to see a map of his own country. And so,
Kid Rock gets better treatment when he gets the Oval. You know?
Yes. And a Trump official helpfully told Politico that the goal of convening the Europeans on the same day with Zelensky was, quote, "to say we're in charge, you'll sign on to anything we say." So they are not trying to hide that they do not give a fuck what the biggest countries in Europe think. So, Ben, just to spell it all out, right? Putin gets the pomp and circumstance, and that is all he cares about, right? Like Putin wants the image of
he's
himself.
an equal of the U.S. president.
Yes, equal of the U.S. Welcome back into the West. The Europeans look like children. And as you were starting to get into, they're all just kissing Trump's ass, thinking that that's their only strategy. And then Zelensky gets kind of a temporary reprieve. He has a good meeting, wears a suit. He like kind of does the dance. But like he's being pressured to give up a fifth of his country, right? Like that's what's on the table here. So it's just when you kind of spell it all out, like it's not hard to see where Trump's sympathy lies here.
Yeah, I mean, you said it well. I just add three things to this. The first is your point about like Vladimir Putin has been across the table from everybody for 25 years, right? Sergei Lavrov has outlived and outserved, 10 secretaries of state.
Outsmoked.
Outdrank. I mean, that guy used to, I remember being at summits and, talk about
hammering.
Yeah. But I respect it. I mean, I don't respect him, but I mean, but look, to just set the table of how much the Russians understood and were in on the joke here, right? Sergei Lavrov arrived in Alaska wearing a CCP sweatshirt, okay? That's USSR, for those of you who don't know the translation. I mean, if that doesn't tell you everything about the summit...
Incredible.
Right? I mean, it's trolling, it's messaging back home. I'm sure they were dunking on all the Russian versions of Fox News. He literally arrived in the United States wearing a USSR sweatshirt, right? Just laughing at us. We get to red carpet treatment and all this stuff, and then we get to basically dunk on you as we show up. Putin had this kind of smirk on his face. He knows he was an indicted war criminal. Now he's invited here. He's in the briefs. He gets to speak first at the press conference. Truly bizarre.
Which is crazy. The host country should speak first.
Because you get to frame the meeting. So Putin gets to frame the meeting. It's businesslike. It was great. We agree on everything. And Trump's like going, Russia, you know. So that's the first thing.
Putin invites him to come to Moscow next.
The Russians got this joke completely. Like they give up nothing and they get like basically completely laundered back into the good graces of the U.S. president, and the rest of the world looks at this and says, Putin won. He won the war in Ukraine. Like the Americans folded to him, right? That's one thing. Second thing is the map point you make, because Trump said before the summit, it's a real estate deal. He's constantly talking about maps. He's got a map up. I was deeply offended by this because you will recall how many times the right wing threw quote unquote Munich at us, right? Mm-hmm. So this was like when Neville Chamberlain met with Hitler and essentially gave away Czechoslovakia in 1938 and, appeasement. Now, that used to be framed as the right wing commentators saying anything that wasn't what they wanted was Munich, right? Because if you don't like bomb Iran, it's Munich, or if you talk to Cubans, it's Munich. That's actually wrong. Like the real disgrace of Munich was the idea of two bigger countries coming together and carving up smaller countries on maps without them being present. So yes, this time I think the Munich analogy holds. Trump doesn't understand how offensive it is to most of the world, including certainly Central and Eastern Europeans, at the idea that an American president can sit down with a Russian president and look at maps of a smaller country as if it's Donald Trump's to give away. And so that is a lasting damage to any American credibility. There is no rules-based order anymore. There's no state sovereignty respect anymore. But there's also no respect for the dignity of any country other than the United States, Russia, and China. That's Trump's. Those are his buddies. That's the company he keeps. Maybe the Gulf, the Saudis get in there too, and the Emiratis. And then the last thing is, I'm so fucking sick and tired of seeing these European leaders feel like they went to the class and learned the lesson that you have to kiss this guy's ass and call him a peacemaker. And, I get why they're doing it, but guess who doesn't give up anything? Putin, right? Or she. Trump runs into a brick wall with those guys, and
or Netanyahu.
And he folds. Or Netanyahu. He folds. He folds when you push back. And I will say to the Europeans' credit, and Friedrich Merz seems like he's got some backbone here, and Macron seems like
Georgia Maloney is the one.
Georgia Maloney's got some backbone,
staring him down.
So I give them some credit, but at a certain point, this flattery is not going to be the answer. You, Europe, have a gigantic economy. If you take the EU, and I know it's
much
hard,
bigger than the Russian economy.
Yeah, you've got a lot going for you here, and you don't need to be so JV about it. I think it was smart of them to give them some credit to show up all together. The people they chose were important. Right?
I know it was smart. I wasn't sure about the babysitting strategy at first because I was like, oh man, you throw a half dozen really annoying European leaders in a room with is Macron gonna wear well in this meeting? I couldn't tell, but you're right, it did work out.
Well, because Maloney, she's in the Trump
loves her.
She was a Mar-a-Lago invitee. The Finnish guy is both on the border of Russia, but he's also kind of a right winger. And then you got Merz, Macron, Starmer. So it was the right mix, and you got the EU people there. Guy. But the only thing I would change going forward is can we just and it's not because I don't like Trump, which I obviously don't. It's just just talking about what a deal maker he is, and at a certain point, and we're still talking about Zelensky's suit. You guys have interests, and Putin doesn't give an inch, and he gets what he wants, and that seems to be the real lesson of negotiation with Trump. Is if you don't give an inch, he won't come back for a foot.
Every time you said maps, I just thought of the Yeah song. Great rock band song. That was an excerpt from Pod Save the World, the show I do every week with Ben Rhodes, where we talk about the biggest issues happening in national security and foreign policy all over the world. Thank you for watching. Please, if you can, subscribe to Pod Save America here on YouTube. The right wing is kicking our ass on YouTube, and what that means is that when people search for political news, they get garbage from Ben Shapiro or TPUSA or other right-wing crap. And when you subscribe to us, you help us surface good information into the YouTube algorithm so people can find it. So please subscribe to Pod Save America, subscribe to Pod Save the World, and you can actually check out the rest of this episode on the Pod Save the World YouTube channel.